All right. Just thank you for the valiant effort in pronouncing my name. It was actually quite close. I'm with the Austrian Institute of Technology. I'm a PhD student. My co-author and PhD supervisor, Hilda Tellioğlu, is sitting right there in the audience. And together, we are doing research on volunteers in crisis and disaster management. In this specific paper, we investigated groups of volunteers and the friction between them and emergency organizations in crisis and disasters. So what's a volunteer? When a crisis or disaster occurs in the event of an earthquake, a flooding, a fire, a landslide, many people will come to help. And those are people like you and me who have no professional training in crisis and disaster management, who are not part of a professional organization. And nevertheless, the affected population itself often becomes the first responder, and people from around the affected area will come to help. This is an almost universal phenomenon that has been known for a long time. It was first scientifically documented by one Mr. Samuel Henry Prince in his PhD thesis, which dates back to 1920. And he described the aftermath of the explosion of a munitions ship in the harbor of Halifax, which flattened half of the city. And what you see here is an image of some of the 300 volunteers in Halifax that sewed bandages from linen. So these were efforts from within civil society. They did not need external coordination. And this is pretty much true to today. It's been reported again and again and again. Nevertheless, crisis and disasters are firmly the domain of professional, formal emergency organizations. And when volunteers invariably emerge on the disaster side, professional organizations will try to manage them. This has two reasons. First of all, they want to make good use of the workforce that volunteers provide, because a lot of physical labor is usually needed in the wake of crisis and disasters. So here, for example, you see volunteers with the Red Cross filling sandbags to combat the flooding of the river Danube in Austria. The other reason that professional organizations try to manage volunteers is to prevent them from doing harm. Because volunteers are not professional, they often do not have the complete operational picture. They do not know how to best react to a crisis and disaster, so they may take actions that either impede relief efforts or endanger their own physical health and well-being, also psychological health and well-being. Now, during the refugee crisis of 2015, in Austria, we noticed quite a peculiar and amazing aspect of the response of civil society to this humanitarian crisis. And this is not easily reconcilable with what traditional volunteer management does. I want to give you an example. This is a scene from the height of the refugee crisis, 2015. And what you see here, front and center, are members of a formal professional organization, the Red Cross in this case. They are clearly identifiable, they wear uniforms, and their roles and their place in the line of command are visible. What you see here also is a volunteer who is with the Red Cross, so she's helping the Red Cross, she's extending the capabilities of the Red Cross. And then, over to the right, you have this lady. She's also wearing a uniform. Makeshift uniform, high visibility vest, and on the back of it, it says Head of Translation. And those gentlemen over there are wearing similar uniforms. You can maybe see a number on the front of the high visibility vest of the gentleman in front. So there's some form of coordination here. There is an organization. There is maybe a chain of command. And this is interesting for us as people who research volunteers, because this is not one formal organization that manages a bunch of individual volunteers. These are two independent, distinct organizations that work alongside each other. This also presents something of a conundrum, because you see these two organizations are vastly different in their organizational structure. One of them is emergent and problem solving. The volunteers react to a problem that they see and form ad hoc organizations to address this problem. So there is a very fluent structure there. There is high flexibility. And on the other hand, there are formal organizations who build on years and years and years of experience with very clearly defined processes and vertical hierarchies. and a strict chain of command. And those two organizational paradigms are not really interoperable. Additionally, the volunteers use new media technologies, first and foremost social media and messaging groups, to organize themselves, to organize their relief efforts. And this works very well for them. They appropriate this infrastructure and use it to great success. However, the formal organizations, they have difficulties adapting these new technologies because their organizational structures do not easily provide the adaptation of rapidly developing technologies. They are built for sustainable relief efforts on tried and tested methods. So they are overwhelmed by the amount of information that is available on social media and by the rapidity that it is used and adapted by volunteers. And this use of ICT actually contributes to the gap because it's a unilateral advantage to one participant. Our session is called Decision Making. And this right there is a huge gap in decision making because it prevents information exchange, because it prevents the two organizations from working together. So for us that we do research in volunteers in crisis and disaster management, this was a mystery to be unraveled. We wanted to know what is actually going on in this place, in this gap. What is happening there? What is the type of friction that is in there? And secondly, can we maybe apply technology in a way that decreases this gap instead of increasing it? So, what we did, we went out and talked to representatives from both sides of the coin. We did group discussions with representatives of the Red Cross and of another humanitarian organization active in Austria during the refugee crisis. And we led semi-structured interviews with representatives from volunteer groups. All of them had been with their volunteer groups from the beginning and were part of the inner circle, the steering committee, depending on the form of organization that the group used. And all of these people had been active in the refugee crisis in 2015. We recorded a total of 14 hours of data from 17 participants. And this was our data set. And we did an inductive thematic analysis on this data set. In the end, we arrived at 12 distinct themes. And what we did at the end, we shifted our analytic focus. We looked at what each theme actually means for the interaction between volunteers and formal organizations. And we call this dynamics of interaction. It's not another layer of abstraction, it's rather a shift in the analytic lens that we used. In total, we found 12 dynamics of interaction that concern the gap between formal organization and emergent groups. And this provided us with a formal framing for the gap, because this had not been done before. There was no formalized framework for what is actually causing friction between the two groups. More importantly, it provided us with a map that could potentially allow us to pinpoint where to apply technology to solve the problem. Now, I'm not going to go through all of this due to time constraints. I'm going to concentrate on the three most important parts of it, or the three parts that I consider most important for technological implications. First of all, none of the participants were a priori opposed to coordination, to collaboration. None of them said, nah, we don't like those guys, we do our own thing. The volunteers, on the one hand, appreciated the stable structures that formal organizations provide. Because they have the experience, because they have the structures, volunteers could go to them and ask for help, ask for further steps. And this, you see here on the bottom a quote by one participant from an informal organization, from a volunteer group. And he actually explicitly said, we need a bridge with the professional organizations, because he realized that both of them are doing the same thing with parallel structures, and that efforts that emerge from civil society are hardly from the beginning sustainable, exactly because they don't have the experience on how to do this. Now, there are two things that impede this general willingness to cooperate. The first is that volunteer groups will reject external rules and structures that are imposed by formal organizations. They have a strive to remain an intact group, to keep their internal group structure. And this is almost autopoietic in nature. Take, as an example, the quote down here. This is from a representative of a formal organization. And he told of a case where volunteers developed a running organization, and then the formal organization arrived. And he said, we saw they did not things how they were supposed to be. So they had to establish the necessary rules. And, of course, this caused friction. This is taken a bit out of context and rather polemic. It paints the formal organization as some form of dictatorship. Of course, they are not. What they wanted to establish are health and safety regulations, attendance lists, and insurance for the volunteers. These are quite sensible things to want, but the volunteers perceive them as a hindrance to their direct relief efforts. A second thing that impedes cooperation is that the information spaces of actors are disconnected. By this, I do not only mean that they do not know whom to contact. They don't even know a lot of the time on which network to contact them. Is this volunteer group on Facebook? Do they have a Twitter handle? Maybe they only have a WhatsApp group. How do I get into that WhatsApp group? So this is what the quote down there from a representative from a formal organization is about. They wanted to get in contact because volunteers were blocking access to an incident site, and she just couldn't. She had no idea how to contact them. In the further course of the group discussion, another participant pointed out, oh yeah, they had a Facebook group. I have a contact in there. So he had a personal contact with this Facebook group, and only through that could he get at all in contact with the volunteers. Right, so now we know that there is a general willingness to cooperate, and we also know we know now where to apply technology, or where we could apply technology. So, first, for a rejection of external rules and structures, we propose to establish a technological mediator that allows both groups to keep their respective organization, their respective communications infrastructure. We postulate that it is possible to allow both groups to remain intact and not require volunteers to break up their group and sign up on some volunteering platform. This is something that usually goes without saying for formal organization. No formal organization would ask another formal organization to please abandon their ICT tools so that both of them could exchange information. So why don't we do the same thing for volunteers? This is actually becoming technologically possible. Second, we don't know in the digital space where volunteers have their coordination structures. And I think social media does not afford us currently to find out. However, we do know where they are physically. They will be at the incident site. So rather than search them in the digital space, we propose turning things around. Establish a beacon at the incident site, or multiple beacons, that links to a shared digital information space. Make that discoverable for volunteers, because they also need information. They want information. So they will use this shared information space. And these two design implications, are how we postulate that we can decrease the gap between emergent organizations, emergent groups, and the professional formal organizations. Now, in our paper, we propose an example architecture that uses these two implications. And I will not tell you about that right now. Instead, I urge you to read our paper, to read about the rest of the socio-technical dynamics and how this fits and furthers the research on volunteers in crisis and disaster management. Thank you very much.
Do we have questions for our speaker?
You can just shout and I will repeat the question.
Okay, I'm Stacey Branham from the University of California, Irvine, and I'll be very loud because there's no microphone. And I hear that asking questions is cool. So I was very interested in this rejecting external rules and structures, and I was wondering if there are other kind of conflicts of interest that arose in your analysis that might pose a threat to any technological solution you generate.
So the question was regarding the conflicts, the rejection of external rules and structures, and whether there were any other conflicts that we discovered in our analysis. Yes, this gap that I mentioned between formal organizations and emergent groups, this is almost an inherent conflict. It's like a given. There is in the very organizational structure a conflict in the fluidity that emergent groups have and the rigid structure that formal groups have. And this is an inherent part of crisis and disaster management. Actually, you can't even solve that conflict, or I do not currently see a way to solve this conflict technologically because it is so inherent in how these groups are structured. Is that a good answer to your question?
Yeah, I'll shout to that. I think I was like again. So part of this conflict, so you're describing it as sort of a structural, organizational structure conflict, and I think that's actually good to mention. But I do wonder how you'll get people to buy into I1 and I2 without sort of building kind of trust relationships between these things. It'd be useful to maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Thank you for this question. The question was about how do we get people to actually buy into what we propose in I1 and I2, and the question was also on trust. I think that getting them to buy into both of them, since they try to establish a shared information space, from the perspective of volunteers, the incentive is that they need or they want information about how to help, where to help, what is there actually to do. It's not that they are completely opposed to sharing information. They want this information. So this is for the volunteers why I think they would use the shared information space constituted by I1 and I2. For the formal organizations, they want to know what is going on. They want to know which groups are active. And if with I2 we deploy a beacon that links to a digital information space and thereby kind of implicitly links this information space with a location, we can give them an idea of who is active in this location, or we think that we can give them an idea of who is active in this location. The matter of trust is a very good and important question that we sadly did not get to address extensively in our paper. We think this will foster trust, especially in tertiary networks, because once you have a group in there and treat their social media group as a permanent structure, like their Facebook group being a permanent entity in this information space, you can start to build trust, because you can keep one identity for this network, or even speakers in this network. For example, what we envisioned, just very shortly, is Facebook and WhatsApp and Telegram and pretty much every other messaging service provides chatbot APIs. Add a chatbot to the group. Make the group be able to talk to the chatbot. In this way, they can exchange information with the information space and keep their group on social media. Was this okay as an answer for your question? Okay.
You don't expect hard questions to be answered in 42 seconds.
Yeah. But we can. I'd be happy to talk about that afterwards. I have so much to say about this topic. Okay.
I'll continue the tradition of shouting. Wendy Norris, University of Colorado Boulder. I'm interested in your thoughts about the organizational or informational gap between the professional responders and the ad hoc groups. Did you find that the concerns were about the information quality being generated by the ad hoc groups, or was it more about temporal coordination?
So the question was about trust in the information created, and it is, of course, an aspect. So we know that trust in information from social media is limited. And I think this also ties into the previous question. When you make a group permanent, you can start to trust not in the information without the context, but trust in the group that provides the information. And I think this would be a good start. All right, I think my time is up. Thank you very much.
We have our third speaker, Bettina Nissen, from the University of Edinburgh, to present the paper, Should I Agree?